Hello, I am the eccentric raven, reader, and writer, and I know that the most effective way for writers to learn is to read books. So I'm here to announce this reading challenge that I'm going to call the Save the Cat Yearlong Reading Challenge. So this starts in 2026, and it will last the whole year, and so for it you'll read at least 11 books. So one book that you'll read will be one of the books that explains the Save the Cat theory that Blake Snyder created, and also read 10 books where it'd basically be one book for each of the story genres of which are part of that Save the Cat theory. So you might have heard before about Save the Cat, and so it's basically this theory that was created by Blake Snyder, and now I like to call it the Save the Cat theory because there have been some who have called that a formula or a method or a technique, and I've seen how some people have put a stigma on that. We're like, oh, formula, the F word, that's a bad thing. Well, it's not a bad thing, but I have found it's kind of more appropriate to call it the Save the Cat theory. You have to realize that he came up with this idea after he had analyzed many movies. He had analyzed the story of hundreds of movies, and it was from his analysis that he had noticed, when you look at it, every film is following this 3-act format, and it always involves a main character, protagonist, he calls the hero. I prefer to say protagonist, a protagonist who has a problem and they have a want. The want is what they believe will solve the problem. But over the course of the story, going over this 3-act story, the protagonist comes to realize that what they wanted was not actually what they needed. And so it's the whole process of going through change in some sort of way, whether that change is for the better, for positive happy ending, or for the worse, for a tragedy. And so part of Blake Snyder's Save the Cat theory is that when you look at it, there's 10 stories out there. And so Blake Snyder was the first to get that idea. And since then there have been other writers who have analyzed and seen how many other stories from over the ages have basically followed that same kind of theory. So Jessica Brody wrote, her writing craft books on, Save the Cat writes a novel. And so she analyzed and was able to notice how this is a theory that's been applied in many stories from over the centuries, thousands of years. Because when you analyze it, you will see the Save the Cat method in use for ancient Greek plays, for Shakespearean plays, for Geoffrey Chaucer works, and for Jane Austen novels, Charles Dickens novels, many 20th century books, 21st century books. It's basically every good story basically kind of covers this kind of idea. A protagonist trying to solve their problem the wrong way before they eventually learn how to solve it the right way. And so this reading challenge is meant to help both writers and also readers, with enjoying good stories. So if you're a writer, this challenge will help you out with understanding what it is that good stories do. And this should help you out as a writer, whatever stage you are at in your career. So whether you're a writer who is not yet published, but just aspiring, or if you're an already published author, whether self-published or traditionally published, the Save the Cat method can really help you out a lot with learning what it is that other authors have done well and done right, that made their books good, that made them successful, and what it is that you can learn from it. Now, and even if you're not an author, if you're an avid reader, a bookworm, I think reading up more on this will help you out with kind of better appreciating other stories out there, whether it be with appreciating your favorite books or come to appreciate other books, what it is that made your favorite movies, your favorite TV shows so good. So you can join this challenge by joining the Storygraph, which I have linked below. And so in the Storygraph, I have examples there of both some of the Save the Cat books, both those by Blake Snyder and those by other writers, and also some examples of books for each of the 10 different story types. And so if you join in, you can add, other books there. Now, the other thing, too, about participating in this challenge is that, it's always possible that you're going to think like, well, I don't know if I'm interested in reading any of those, example books. However, as you read throughout the year, as you read whatever's in your TBR or whatever you're reading for other readathons, it's very likely that at some point you'll read something where you'll say, hey, this could go under this Save the Cat story type. Which does often happen with me nowadays, now that I've come to learn and understand it as I read books and watch movies and such. I've been able to see as to what kind of story type it is that you could put under. So what I'm going to be going over is each of the story types and some examples of books that go under each of these types, both as showing my pile of possibilities for my TBR, as well as what it is that you might like to check out. To begin the challenge, it'll be best to read one of the Save the Cat books. So there's always the original book that he wrote that came out in 2005. Now, but since that time, Snyder has written follow-up books where he's analyzed other movies that have come out since then and added on a number of other kind of elements to the story-making process and other things to consider. And there have also been other writers who have used his theory and applied it. So you see, my intro to the Save the Cat theory was Jessica Brody's Save the Cat Writes a Young Adult Novel. And I would actually probably say this might actually be the best of all your choices. Because what's especially beneficial about this one is that this one came out less than 5 years ago. And so here is where it is that she's all up to date, where basically the questions that people have asked in the past 20 years, about this whole thing, she answers a lot of those. Even if you don't read or write young adult, I think this book would be beneficial. Now, I've also read her book, Save the Cat Writes a Novel. And now this one is a bit thinner. The info here is a bit shorter, but also a bit more concise. So I do see how this could be a good starting point as well. In fact, it's one thing I should note here too is that you don't necessarily need to kind of read all of these books about the Save the Cat method, because in the end, I think if you read just kind of one or two, they'll just kind of basically give you the idea of all the story beats and kind of how to recognize these storytelling elements. Although at the same time, if you're like me and you're curious, then it can also be good to kind of branch out to read other books on it. So a book here that I recently got is called Save the Cat Writes for TV, which is by Jamie Nash, who has done a lot of screenplay writing. With all the TV that I've seen, I've been kind of curious to learn a bit more about TV writing. I like how the subtitle is the last book on creating binge-worthy content you'll ever need. And if you go to Storygraph, you will get to see some of the other options that you can select from there. Alright, so the first story genre type is Rite of Passage, which you could also call a coming-of-age story. So it's a story where a main character is going through a problem in life that would often be a common life kind of problem, which might be dealing with death or loss, dealing with growing up, dealing with a midlife crisis. And so the main character comes up with the wrong way to deal with the problem, but over the course of the story learns the proper way to deal with it, mainly with just kind of accepting life's problems. So some Rite of Passage stories that can be options for this challenge include Anne of Green Gables, The Book Thief by Marcus Zuzak, To All the Boys I've Loved Before by Jenny Han, and The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini. So I'm especially interested in reading these two because of how Jessica Brody has written some specific analyses of both of these stories. In fact, that's actually one thing I forgot to mention is how in any of these kind of Save the Cat craft books that you read, they will have some examples that will have entire story analyses of all 3 acts, of all story beats of the story. And you can also find other books if you go to the Save the Cat website, where they list different story types there, and examples of both movies and books that fall under these types. So then the next story type is called Whydunit. So this is basically the theory of how a good mystery story goes. So it's pretty brilliant about the Whydunit theory is that it's pointed out how when you look at it, like every mystery, especially a murder mystery, it's not just a whodunit story for murder story. When you really look at it, most murder mysteries tend to be about why done it, because in the end, most murder mysteries end up being like kind of some sort of a social commentary where it looks like kind of the darker side of human nature, of which ends up being like kind of, behind, the motive. I'm normally not that much of a mystery reader, but I like to branch out, read stuff I don't normally read, and so what I have here on my TBR that you can put under this includes One for the Money by Janet Ivanovich. Yes, this is known for being a mystery comedy. And of course there's so many other choices too, like many Agatha Christie novels, the Alphabet series by Sue Graft, and yes, like some other examples include like Nancy Drew, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, The Da Vinci Code, Gone Girl. Now the next story type is known as Golden Fleece. So this is the story of a journey. So the name comes from how in Greek mythology there were the heroes Jason and the Argonauts who sought out the Golden Fleece. The significance of this story type is how there's going to be the main character and there will be their team or buddy. This team can be just one person, or it can be a few people, and there's the prize at the end that they are going for. But little do the characters know that what really matters is the internal story inside themselves. It's like what the lesson that they learn along the way on the journey is what really matters. So oftentimes with Golden Fleece stories, we will think about some fantasy quest stories. So there are classic fantasy stories like, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and there's also, Terry Brooks' The Sword of Shannara, and there's the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. And of course there's George R.R. Martin's Fire and Ice series, also known as Game of Thrones. Now, but a Golden Fleece story can also include a heist. So like an example of that would be Mistborn. Six of Crows is a heist, and so this is a perfect example of a Golden Fleece story. Now, of course, it's not necessarily like, high fantasy or epic fantasy. So we can also find stories like that in horror, like Stephen King's The Body. You can also find it in thrillers, too, like the Inheritance games. And, of course, there's the science fiction book Ready Player One. Now, so the next story is the buddy love story. And so this is basically a story about, two individuals coming together. And this can be a friendship, or this can be a romance, or it can even be a story like a pet story. And so it's basically there are two different halves that make a whole. They both have their own flaws to overcome, and there's an obstacle in their way that they have to overcome. So an example of a buddy love romance would be The Fault in Our Stars. And an example of a pet friendship would be Because of Winn-Dixie. Jane Austen novels like Pride and Prejudice are buddy love stories. Many Nicholas Sparks books, like The Notebook, are buddy love stories. So now, the next story type is also one of the most kind of broad types. It's called Dude with a Problem. So this is a story where the main character is suddenly thrust into some sort of, surprise conflict and has to find a way to deal with it. And there's so many different story types that go under this. So these can be disaster movies. It can be survival stories. It can even be something low stakes and more at home, like An Unexpected Visit from In-Laws. It can be a post-apocalyptic story. So the problem could be surviving in the wilderness, like with Hatchet. It can be surviving in space, like with The Martian. Or even just any sort of kind of survival game, like in The Life of Pi, trying to deal with the problem of a tiger that wants to eat you. Yeah, it can be an alien invasion, like, the fifth wave. It can be dealing with, like, the sudden murder of a friend and just having to deal with all the social conflicts surrounding that, which is the subject of The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. It could be something like Stephen King's Misery, the story of an author who is being held prisoner by his fan. Now, the next story type is monster in the house, and so this is the formula of many horror stories, where it's basically there's something that could be called a monster that is in an enclosed space, and there's some sort of a curse behind the origin of it, which basically means there's some kind of like, reason that kind of in a way has to deal with the theme or social commentary. So this can be a horror story like, The Shining or The Exorcist, but it can also be on kind of a broader level too. So it can be like Jaws, where that enclosed space is the ocean. It can be like Alien, where that enclosed space is a spaceship, or it can even be something like the film Independence Day, where the monster is the aliens that are invading and that enclosed space is actually the entire Earth. So some kind of disaster stories can also fall under like the monster in the house category too. Like, for example, Jurassic Park. And a book that I want to read that actually falls in that category is Wilder Girls. This is basically like a female version of The Island of Dr. Moreau and Lord of the Flies. And the way it says it here is they told us to wait and stay alive. So it's all being in the enclosed space of this island and these girls having to fight for that survival. Alright, the next story type is probably my favorite one, since so many of my favorite books and movies go under this. So this is the superhero story. So the superhero story is basically where there's a character who has great power or great abilities and is destined for greatness and often has a rival getting in their way who they have to overcome. So this can be superheroes in like, comic book, superhero. It can also mean kind of like, the chosen one that's often used in fantasy. But a superhero does not necessarily need to have like, magical powers or superpowers. Like, it can even be someone who just has like some really great abilities, whether it be the power of charisma and leadership, just basically kind of serving that role of being like the ultimate hero. And they also don't necessarily need to be heroes and like, the good guy. They can also be a villain, super villain. Perhaps one of the most notable superhero stories ever would be Harry Potter. And there are definitely a lot of, fantasy and science fiction stories that would go under superhero. And there's also like some big, thrillers that would too. So like examples of superhero that go under fantasy and sci-fi include Children of Blood and Bone, which is very high on my TBR, and Shatter Me by, I just say her name, Tahereh Mafi. Nice name. There's Cinder by Marissa Meyer, Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children by Ransom Riggs, Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief by Rick Riordan, The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, Legend by Marie Lu, and also a thriller like The Bourne Identity. Ooh, I'm especially excited to get into one of those books. Now, the next story type is called institutional. So the idea behind this is that the main character is part of some sort of institution of some sort, and they have 3 different choices on how to deal with this. So they can either join this institution, or escape the institution, or destroy the institution. Now, this has often been the story type for many dystopia stories. So like The Giver is a perfect example of institutional. So also it's 1984. Though it doesn't necessarily mean like a dystopian society, because it can also be something like just being in a bad place or being part of a bad family and having to get out of that, situation. It's like another classic dystopia that goes under that is Fahrenheit 451. And there's definitely other young adult stories that go under that, such as The House of the Scorpion by Nancy Farmer, The Program by Suzanne Young, and Scythe by Neil Shusterman. Now, examples of stories where it's about like escaping from a family include The Help. I don't know if I'm interested in reading that book. If you have read it, let me know your thoughts in the comments. The Help. Did you like it or not like it? I mean, normally I'm not really that into something that's considered to be like a market or a book club, but just depends. And another example of where it's like about escaping or like, being trapped in like a really bad place would be One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. It's about the way mental institutions used to be like back many decades ago. Pretty sad, haunting story. Now the last story type is known as Out of the Bottle. So this is a story where a character like has to go through some sort of experience under magic to learn an important lesson from that. So there are many well-known movies that go under Out of the Bottle. It's like true to the name, Disney's Aladdin is of course a perfect example of that. And films like Groundhog Day is definitely out of the bottle. The Nightmare Before Christmas, Tom Hanks' Big, those are all out of the bottle stories. Character goes through magical experience, almost kind of like being under a spell in a way, and having to learn something from that. And of course there are many books under that as well too. Recently I read Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury, where the characters end up getting caught up in the kind of the spell that's going around the town with this magical carnival. And one story from what I've heard about it, The 5 People You Meet in Heaven by Mitch Albom. From what I've heard, this story sounds like, out of the bottle, where an old man goes through this, near-death, experience and sees heaven. So Jessica Brody mentions 20s Girl by Sophia Kinsella. But I like how the book also mentions some other examples of out of the bottle, like Freaky Friday, Bruce Almighty, The Mask, Liar Liar, Shallow Hal. Yeah, all those are great films. And other examples that Jessica Brody mentioned include If I Stay by Gail Foreman. She also mentions IQ 84 by Haruki Murakami. Yeah, I'm pretty interested in reading stuff by him. Oh, Mary Poppins would also count as out of the bottle. And The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. One of my all-time favorites, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Perfect example of out of the bottle. Now that was actually not the last one. I almost forgot about another story. The last story type is called Fool Triumphant. So the fool is like, referring to, a clown who would usually be like, the butt of jokes. But the clown can find a way to rise above others and shock those who put them down and become the Fool Triumphant. So the Fool Triumphant is basically the underdog story. So a character who is oftentimes looked down upon, but who ends up like challenging and taking on some sort of institution that has put them down. So this has been like the story behind like many inspirational sports films. It's also often been the story about like nerds and geeks who show that they're kind of more than just being like nerds and geeks. Yeah, many Rite of Passage stories could also fall under like Fool Triumphant. So a book here in my TBR that I hope to read under that is Stargirl by Jerry Spinelli. Yeah, a book that's been pretty popular and well-loved and well-acclaimed for a long time. She was elusive, she was today, she was tomorrow, she was the faintest scent of cactus flower, the fitting shadow of an elf owl. We did not know what to make of her. In our minds, we tried to pin her to a corkboard like a butterfly, but the pin merely went through and away she flew. All right, those are the 10 story types. So I hope that in going over this, I've helped out a bit with like dispelling some of the misconceptions about Save the Cat. Because I've heard, before people saying like, well, it just makes every story seem the same. But I want to point out that while going over examples, like for both books and films, like these include some of the greatest books ever written, some of the greatest films ever made. So from here, the rest is just up to you. Just basically read 11 books. You can check out, these examples I've mentioned and what's on Storygraph. So if you have any other questions about Save the Cat or anything related to this, feel free to leave them in the comments. If you disagree with anything, whether it be like, disagreeing with or not liking the Save the Cat method, feel free to share that in the comments. Have you read any of the books that I've mentioned? And if so, what did you think of them? Are there any other examples among some of these other story types that you would like to mention? I hope during 2026 that I'll be able to do a few more videos covering this topic. I do have my own Save the Cat template, and I hope to be able to tweak it up a bit and set up my own website where I can have that available as a tool to help people, especially people who prefer good old Word docs or Google Docs like me. If you don't feel chatty, please leave a comment where you leave an emoji of the hand that is writing something, because that is one of my favorite emojis. Thank you so much for watching. In the words of Kit Boga, you are valuable, and in the words of Brian Regan, take luck.